Well, good morning, everyone. It's just a few short weeks now away from the first day of spring, and you can kind of tell it out there. It's been such a mild winter, but anyway, the snowdrops are starting to pop up around the side of my house. That's always a welcome sight, and all this rain that we're having today, it's Friday here, probably washing away a good bit in the warm weather, is washing away a good bit of the snow and bringing out some mud all over the places. And that's one thing I really look forward to in spring, is the smell of the mud. But anyway, this is the fourth Sunday of Lent, and today we're looking at the 23rd Psalm. It came up in the lectionary, and I looked at it, and I looked at the other passages that are there in the lectionary and said, well, I've kind of preached on those before, and I wonder if I've done anything on the 23rd Psalm ever. And looked back into my files and found that I have never, in my 26 years of ministry, preached on Psalm 23. So we're going to make a go at it this morning. The 23rd Psalm is probably the most memorable passage in the Bible. You talk to people who don't go to church, and if they've heard any Bible at all, or have never been to church, if they've heard anything from the Bible at all, it's likely been the 23rd Psalm. Throughout, I like the King James version of it because it's the one that's most poetic. There are a lot of modern translations that try to, do away with the archaicness of the language, but I think the King James version really captures a lot of the poetic beauty that's there in the passage. Anyway, it's an important one. I remember going through the Join the Church classes, the catechism classes, back when I was like 12, 13 years old. We had to memorize it. It's just that important. This is one of those passages of Scripture that, when you're in a difficult time of life, really speaks. The Lord is my shepherd. It really speaks. Let me read it to you. Got a New Revised Standard Version here, but I'm going to try to do the King James from memory. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of my seminary professors, actually when I was going through the Doctor of Ministry program, when he talked about how to read the Bible, he used to tell an old story about a man who wanted to learn how to read the Bible. And the story goes that the man paid a visit to his village priest and asked the priest to teach him how to read the Bible. So the priest told him to go home and read Psalm 23 over and over and over again, and then come back in a week and tell him what he'd learned. The week passed, and the man returned and told the priest that he had learned that God is like a shepherd. He takes care of us. He protects us. God is with us even in the worst and most fearful of situations. God provides for us abundantly. And so on, he continued for a few more minutes on things one would glean about God from reading the 23rd Psalm at face value. But the priest said, "No, you've picked up a lot of things here, but you didn't get it. Go back and try again for another week." Well, a bit confused, the man thought the priest was nudging him to dig a little deeper, so he went to the library and got all kinds of books on the 23rd Psalm, and he learned just about everything he thought he could possibly ever know about Psalm 23. And a week later, he went back to the priest, and he went on and on and on and on about what this person says and about what that person says and so on and so on. And, after a good 45 minutes or so, the priest just had to cut him off and shut him up. And he told him, "You still haven't gotten it. Come back in another week." Well, the man got pretty angry at the priest and called him a quack who didn't know anything, and then vowed to never come back. Well, several months went by, and a knock came on the church door. The priest opened the door, and it was the man. And he looked like he'd been through hell. Disheveled, unshaven, tears in his bloodshot eyes. And the man looked at the priest and said, "The Lord is my shepherd." And the priest embraced him. He'd learned the meaning of the psalm. The lesson to learn from Psalm 23 is located in the my. The Lord is my shepherd. It isn't enough to know what the psalm says about the Lord, about what God is like. Knowing about God is not the same thing as knowing God. And even more so, knowing everything you could possibly know about a Bible passage called the 23rd Psalm is definitely not the same thing as knowing God. What the psalm says about the Lord doesn't mean anything until it hits us that the Lord is my shepherd. I am a sheep of his own fold. I am his. He is mine. The Lord is my shepherd. Well, Psalm 23 is supposed to have been written by King David, ancient Israel's second and most influential king. If you want to know a little bit about David, well, you can find a little biography of him in 1 Samuel. Samuel tells the story of David. He was the youngest of 7 sons to a guy named Jesse, and that's not Uncle Jesse of the Dukes of Hazzard. Apparently, David had red cheeks and curly hair. He was ruddy in appearance. I always like to laugh at that, ruddy. As the youngest, his main family responsibility was to tend the family sheep, shepherding. That task occasionally involved the heroic work of protecting these sheep from bears and lions, which David rose to the occasion of rather bravely. It's something that prepared him for his later encounter with the Philistine giant named Goliath. But mostly the work of shepherding is the monotonous, boring, ordinary drudge of pasturing them, feeding, watering, and making sure they don't wander off. I suspect that David spent a good deal of time just sitting on slightly higher ground, just watching the sheep and thinking. But you have to ask, what do you think David sat there and thought about? If we are to take into account the David that we meet in the Psalms, he wrote 71 of them, actually more than that, almost 80 of them. David was probably pondering God while he sat and watched those sheep. His Psalms reflect a person of profound faith and prayer who was not unaccustomed to a persistent sense of God's presence with him. Present with him not only in those long, monotonously boring, ordinary days of just sitting and watching sheep burp and chew cud, but also with him under much adversity from powerful enemies, not only bears and lions, but later when he became king, powerful enemies, the kings of other nations, his own generals, his own son. So many people were out to get him when he was the king. Look, even in his youth, we can see that David was a man after God's own heart, as was reflected when he was the only man in all Israel to fearlessly stand up for God's honor in the face of Goliath's insults of Israel's God. Well, if I were to imagine how David got his poetic fodder for the 23rd Psalm, I like to think that he must have had a moment one day when his father's flock was reposing by a cool stream running through a vast, nully green pasture. The sheep were safe and well fed and just lying there serenely burping and chewing their cud. And it must, seeing that, it must have occurred to David, this is the peace I feel in the presence of the Lord who is my shepherd. I want for nothing. I fear nothing. My Lord is with me. Bears and lions are out there to predate on us, but my Lord protects me. The pastures are abundant and green. My Lord sets a table of abundance before me, and the joy, my cup runneth over. Yeah, bears and lions are after me. Nah. The Lord's goodness and loving kindness are what really stalk me, what really pursue me, what really follow me. This peaceful repose in the presence of the Lord is what I will know all the days of my life. And I will dwell in my God's house forever. Imagine coming up with that while simply watching a bunch of dirty sheep mindlessly chew their cud. Somehow it occurred to David that God does for him what he was doing for those sheep. The Lord was present and watching over him and was indeed his shepherd. Just thinking about that, God does speak to us and does so often in wonderfully ordinary ways. As a boy shepherd, early in life, David learned God was wonderfully with him. And the presence of the Lord was incredibly reposeful. He had nothing to fear. God abundantly provides and protects. And this would be so for him for the rest of his life. Well, having learned the Lord is my shepherd, David grew up and became the greatest king Israel has ever had, as well as the most prominent voice of spiritual song and prayer in the lives of both Jews and Christians. David even had a profound impact on the spiritual life of Jesus, the Son of God incarnate, God himself. David impacted the spiritual life of God himself. Think about it. But anyway, in the glimpse we get of Jesus' prayer life in the Gospels, we see that Jesus prayed the Psalms of David. In fact, Psalm 22 was on his lips when he was on the cross. Psalm 22 begins with, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then the whole of Psalm 22 describes uncannily well the experience of crucifixion from the eyes of one being crucified. As you work on towards the end of Psalm 22, the psalmist passes through a moment of silence. Something happens. And it resumes with praising the God who has raised this once forsaken person from the dead. Jesus' last words that he spoke before he died were Psalm 31, verse 5. Into your hand I commit my spirit. That verse ends in profound certainty with, you have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. God the Father had not forsaken his Son, but rather redeemed him, bought him back from death. Well, if the lesson of Psalm 23 is the Lord is my shepherd, let me give my own experience of that. I learned of the Lord as a small child. As a small child, my mother took us to church. When my parents divorced, church attendance got very sporadic. See, back in those days, churches didn't know what to do with families going through divorce. It's the early 70s. Even so, I kept being drawn to reading the Bible stories that were in that Bible storybook that Mom made sure lived on one of the end tables we had there in the living room. I even went to thumbing through the big King James Family Bible that we had prominently displayed when you first entered our house. Drawn is an important word. I kept feeling drawn to want to read those stories. My best friend's mom used to drag him and I off to church and to vacation Bible school in my preteen and young teen years. And my father, he occasionally took us to church, as well as the mother of my first girlfriend back in 7th and 8th grade. You know, if I wanted to date her daughter, I had to go to their Baptist church. Anyway, my late teens, church was only on Christmas Eve and Easter. But for some reason, God and becoming a minister were thoughts that were quite present there in the back of my mind, inexplicably so. That sense of being drawn still hovered about me. And finally, at age 19, just a couple of weeks before I turned 20, I threw a New Year's Eve party to which no one showed up. And I decided if that's the sum total of my life, it wasn't worth living. And so I gave it to Jesus. And the next morning I called my best friend's mom, Mom Landis, and I asked if she was going to church, and she said yes, and I said, I'll see you there, and I've been going ever since. And that call to ministry really became my only real choice of vocation. The only thing I wanted to do. And so I started that long process of preparation for ministry, which in the Presbyterian circle it requires a university degree and then a master's degree. I actually did a few more years after getting into the ministry and got a doctorate, so woohoo, more paper. Those university years at first were difficult for me, and I didn't realize it, but I was mildly depressed and living with some anxiety. Mental health was very stigmatized back then, so there wasn't much education about it, nor did people seek help for it. And during university, I had to work, which killed my social life at school, and I had to go to school, which killed my social life with work people. I'd date and get dumped. It was hard. But the thing I really enjoyed was my studying. One day during the spring of my first year, I was out for a run and heading up the hill on campus, and it was a big hill. Something happened. It was as if a door opened up, and I realized I wasn't alone. Jesus is with me. I am and will never be alone. Well, in my 26th year of ordained ministry, that's what I'm in now, from the time of that run up the hill until now, what's happened? I've been married, during which I lived 3 of those years with a full-blown untreated anxiety disorder, panic attacks and everything, on top of that persistent mild depression that I spoke of. Once again, mental health back in those days, stigmatized, particularly among people going into the ministry. You don't ask for help, nor do you admit to yourself what you're living with. Anyway, 10 years of marriage, divorced. I rebounded, wound up unemployed and guest room surfing for nearly a year. Moved to Canada, remarried, started a family. Finally tried to treat that depression with antidepressants. Unfortunately, one of the side effects was an uncontrollable compulsion to drink. I put my family through alcoholism. And after finally realizing I was powerless over alcohol, my shepherd took away my compulsion to drink. It totally disappeared one very painful night. I then went off the antidepressants, and I've been sober for going on 12 years now. I never want to be that shame-filled person again. Addiction is hell. Please don't judge people who suffer it. Now, what keeps me going in this ongoing life of recovery is the persistent presence of my Lord, of my shepherd, whose loving kindness is new every morning, even as I find myself in the darkest valley. I am not alone. My shepherd is there. These 26 years of ministry have been difficult times to be in ministry for ministers, particularly here in North America, as the church has declined to the point of having just about died off. The church in North America exists largely in the form of small congregations of less than 30 in attendance, who are mostly elderly and mostly pretty tired. The pandemic we just went through was socially, emotionally, spiritually brutal for just about everybody. During those lockdowns, we discovered how to be online. This online presence was and continues to be a blessing, but we can't forget the importance of real face-to-face relationships to a vibrant faith. Physical gathering as the people of God has been fundamental to the people of God since Old Testament days. Regardless, when I look at and walk among the people of the church that's left, I find something nearly all of us have in common. We still come because we know the Lord is my shepherd. Remember how you came to know that, and don't be shy to share it. Amen. I'd like to sing a song for you. This is The King of Love, My Shepherd Is. It's a paraphrase of the 23rd Psalm. I especially like it, and I like the older, more traditional lyrics to it than what you find in a lot of the newer hymnals.
The King of Love, my shepherd is, whose
Perverse and foolish oft I strayed, but yet in love you sought me, and on your shoulder gently laid, and home rejoicing brought me. In death's dark veil I feared none kneel, with you, dear Lord, beside me. Thy rod and staff my comfort still, your cross before to guide me. Thou spreadst a table in my sight, anointing grace bestowing, and oh, what rapture of delight. My cup is overflowing, and so through all the length of days thy good